In this episode of Over the Bonnet, I get to chat with a man who has spent his life in the transport and construction industries. Terry Mundey has taken up writing during his retirement and has already written 2 books and has plans for a third.
Over the Bonnet with Mark Piepers.
Well, at least the guests are good. You'll never know what happens with the conversation when it's over the bonnet.
You're kidding me, aren't you?
Terry Mundey, welcome to Over the Bonnet.
Thank you. Great to be here.
You've got an interest in history, your family history. How did that all come about?
Well, the first book that I produced was on the family history. And I've always kept in touch with the older people. And I was always admired that generation, the war and post-war generation, for what they went through. And I worked a lot with my father. And I was always in awe of their ability to do things with very little equipment. They're amazing. They really were. And throw in a sibling, a younger brother, who annoyed the hell out of me to put it all together as a reference for the rest of the family. And I'd got to that stage in life of approaching retirement, and I'd had a pretty serious near-miss accident, and I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I just laughed it off, soldiers get PTSD. But one of the effects was I'd lost the ability to concentrate, to read or write for long periods of time, which were things I had done in the past. So a combination of my admiration of the previous generation, an annoying brother who would leave it alone, and I thought, well, maybe this might get my concentration and mind centred again. So I set out on the task, and it took me a couple of years to research the family, and when I got it all together, we produced it and released it in conjunction with the first family reunion ever, which was a great success in Warwick. And I'm pleased to say the book itself, many members of the family have told me they still use it as a reference when they're talking amongst themselves or explaining history to the next generation. The book comes out, so for me that was very rewarding. So, but in the course of that, I found a couple of other stories as well.
Is it a book just designed for the family?
It has a bit of history in it, but basically, yes, it's the first one is really a reference and a history of the family. And we discovered a few things in the production of that, like the Indigenous connection, which most didn't know about. I did, because I knew my grandmother and a cousin of mine lived with them. We weren't raised in the culture as such, but we were aware of the culture. And many of her sayings and actions, my father acted as a conduit with that knowledge to me. So, and we found out some war history that we didn't know, and some union strife that we weren't aware of, and so that led to the second book, which is the second book is a fiction, but based on real events and real characters.
The near-miss accident, what happened?
Lost the front wheel off a Kenworth at 100 kilometres an hour with 110,000 litres of unleaded on board. That makes you sit up straight and seat.
Talk us through it. What happened?
It involves some legal action after this, so I'll be quite careful. But basically it was just on sun-up on the Bruce Highway, and I was about an hour from my destination, and I heard a large crack. And so instantly, you put the other hand on the steering wheel. Next thing, the front axle broke on the driver's side, and the whole wheel come adrift. And luckily, I still thank God for this, it bounced over a car coming the other way that had a young family in it. So the axle hit the ground, dragged on the bitumen. Luckily, it was my side, the right-hand side, because all the outlet valves for the tankers are on the left-hand side. The right-hand side was covered in sparks. I got the truck pulled up. I got it slowed enough to get it in off the road, but by this time the axle was that hot it set fire to the grass underneath me. And I didn't realise I'd even done it, and your training kicks in then. And I've been a private pilot too, so you do a lot of repetition training there. I realised it was like I was an out-of-body experience. I was standing beside the truck with a fire extinguisher, putting out the grass underneath it. And I noticed to my right there was someone else there, and it was a farmer across the road who saw it happen. And he was there with his extinguisher. And he said to me, "Thank God you're not loaded." And when I told him I was fully loaded, he said, "Oh, if I'd known that, I would have run the other way." So, yeah, but the thing about the whole incident that stuck in my mind was how close it come to destroying a family in that car. Because the front wheel of a Kenworth with the hub attached to 500 kilos.
What was their reaction?
They never even stopped.
No.
They kept going, yeah. And I still to this day don't know whether they probably, they would have, or the father would have had to see it. It bounced straight over the bonnet on an angle into the paddock, and the hub was that hot. When it landed in the paddock on the cane trash blanket, it set fire to the trash. So, I thought, gee, that was close. That was lucky, But a few days later, started to niggle at me. And eventually I got off the highway, because anyone that's been on the highway long enough, the highwayman will get you, as they say. And I'd had enough close shaves, and I thought, well, enough is enough.
What sort of things did you see when you were driving then?
During my career?
Yeah.
I think the earliest one I saw was near Farina in the Northern Territory. I was probably 18 or 19, and I come across a truck that was rolled over and on fire, and I couldn't get to him. He burnt to death. He was still screaming for help when I got there. And in those days, I'm talking 1970, we all carried guns in the trucks. And I went back to the truck. A 19-year-old, I was going to put him out of his misery. And luckily, I'd cleaned the truck out that day and didn't put the gun back in.
Would you have done it?
I don't know. I often ask myself, as I reminisce, but I heard that man scream for 3 months, And funny thing is, since then I'd always had the fear of truck accidents and fire. And when I got to the end of my working life, I took it to the limit with a front wheel covered off. So, I was pretty fortunate to survive.
What was the reaction, though, when you sat? Was it slow motion when it unfolded as you were going through it?
In my mind, I could see as if for those seconds the world slowed down. I didn't even realise that I'd unclipped my seatbelt, and I was standing up in the seat with both hands on the left-hand side of the steering wheel, trying to hold the truck straight, to the extent that I dislocated my shoulder, the right shoulder. And fortunately, I had enough sense not to touch the brake and let it slow to a point where I could get it in off the road.
So why didn't you hit the trailer brakes?
On the modern trucks, they're all as one. The older trucks, we had a handpiece we could operate.
Well, that was the one that I was used to.
The
trailer brake, you'd pull a lever to...
Yeah.
So you didn't go for the trailer brake?
Most of the trucks, they don't exist anymore.
So it didn't have it on the truck that you were driving?
No. Yeah, the old trucks, you could adjust your bias and pull the handpiece on. And in a lot of cases in road trains, you use that all the time to pull yourself straight as you're going down hills, because the trailers will push you, So that option wasn't available. So we just let the speed wash off and got it in, and I walked away. And it was wasn't long after that happened that I realised I've had enough of this. I need to do something else, like retire.
The PTSD, how did that affect you?
Well, I became very cautious, very anxious when I drove. You looked at every culvert. You looked for an escape route all day long. What if it happens here? What if it happens there? And it made you more alert of the oncoming traffic. You to the point where you concentrated that much, you became very tired, and it became. It just wasn't fun at all anymore. It just wasn't fun. And I'd done many things in life, including management, and had my own businesses. But I always went back to trucks in the quiet times or in between times. I'd go back to trucks because I knew the game and I could always get work. But after that, that was it.
What was the best part about driving back in the day when you were enjoying it?
I love being in the bush. I love the country. And I, as a young man, I enjoyed the challenge. I mean, in the territory, we were teenagers basically, and we took pride in the fact that if something happened, we could get ourselves going again. We could fix the gear. No mobile phones, no radios. So we became very practical, very handy, which helped all of us in later life as we got into our own businesses. I think the challenge, and in later life, when I was doing fuel, I would often put my hand up to do the runs out to the properties, because they were wonderful people on the land, and I used to just love going out to all the different stations and dropping the fuel off, and if they were day trips, I'd pick up on my way to work. I'd pick up half a dozen newspapers and half a dozen bottles of milk, and they appreciated that when you got there with the paper and the milk, and by the time you got back at night, you usually had 3 or 4 lunches because they all insisted you have a cup of tea as a singer, So, but I, in the younger years, I just loved the bush. I was in the territory a lot, and just loved the solitude. And in actual fact, in the early 70s, I was carting into an American company building the beef road up to Burralura, American company called Dillingham's. And I got on quite well with the boss. And he said to me that when this project's finished, we're going back stateside to Alaska to build a pipeline and a road. Why don't you come with us? Being young, unattached, I said, cool, why not? Let's go. But I had to go back to the coast, to Townsville, where my folks were, to get all the paperwork. It took about 5 months in those days to get green cards and passports. And so I went back there.
Pre-internet.
Definitely pre-internet, yeah. Morse code had just finished, yeah. So I went back there, and but I was young. I was broke, so I needed a job in those 5 months. And a friend of mine said there's a company down the road. They're looking for someone to drive backhoe and truck. And so I went down there to apply for the job, and the office girl ended up being my wife. So I never got to Alaska until 2 years before COVID. We went together. So, that's how I met my wife.
Is it one of those things that you wish you had gone, apart from the fact that you met your wife? Just work-wise and just the adventure of it.
Oh, yeah, I think so. Because in those days the Americans are that far advanced with their earth-moving gear and transport gear, and it was quite exciting to think about being there and working on those projects. But I don't regret it. I mean, 50 years on, she's still my wife.
Talk about the Americans and their earth moving. The road from Queensland going up to between Mount Isa and Camberwell, the track, and then you hit the Northern Territory roads, which the Americans put together. Was that an indicator of what you were expecting over there?
Yeah, pretty much. But I'd seen, there weren't videos in those days, movies of projects happening over there, and as my father used to say, hydraulics never arrived in Australia with earth-moving gear until the Second World War. They were pretty well advanced, and we still get most of our best earth-moving equipment from America. So it would have been an exciting prospect had the polar bears and the coal not got me.
Now, when you're talking about earth moving in Townsville, in that area, what sort of things were you doing?
Ross River Dam, a lot of subdivisional work. Townsville went through a boom in the 70s, 80s, and then again a decade later. So a lot of subdivisional work, and I've still got a brother there who's 80. Still got 30 men working for him, and he's still the biggest curb and channeling contractor in North Queensland. So it's been in the family, and we grew up with Dad, who travelled all over Australia in the 50s and 60s, in the period when the country was converting a lot of the regional and small towns from septic to sewage reticulation. And he was working for a company called NSN Constructions, who had their origins in Ipswich. But they worked all over the East Coast, and I actually started school in Victoria. And I was only talking yesterday, father put himself through night school and became a licensed drainer and plumber, and worked his way up to a supervisory role with this company. And Monday to Friday, that was his job, and Saturday and Sunday, he had a contract to cut railway sleepers for the railways. So he was a 7-day working man, and at least one day on each weekend I'd be up at 4 to go out with him to the timber lease. And I was only a little weed tacker then, but my job was to light the fire and boil the billy so he could have a cup of tea while he was getting his equipment ready. And to this day, the smell of gum leaves burning on a fire brings back an image of the old man. So it's funny, the memories that stick with you,
How was your relationship with him?
Oh, he was I used to always say he had a pretty basic philosophy. Pat him on the back, kick him in the bum. If they're good, he'd pat you on the back. But he was a tall, wiry man with big hands, but an even bigger heart, and I learnt that much off him. As a kid, you don't realise you're learning, but you're absorbing that information. And when you start work and end up out on your own, it's surprising how many of those lessons come back, even to get an axle out of the mud, the old fulcrum and lever, and if he couldn't do it with a fulcrum and lever, he'd get his axe and go and cut down a bigger lever, So, they were ingenious, an ingenious generation,
What would you say would be the biggest lesson you learned from your father?
He told me once. What people may say or think about us is none of our business. What is our business is to get on with life and do the right thing by ourselves and those around us. So, over the years I've had a few little ventures that I've had to go at, and I've copped criticism, and I learnt just to ignore that. I remember once I started a business in Townsville, transportable building business, and I heard different comments. He's not a builder, he doesn't know what he's doing. So Marie and I built the business up over 5 or 6 years, and then one of the multinationals bought us out, and I was told I was lucky. So you make your own luck.
Well, as John Law says, he's saying the harder he works, the luckier he seems to get.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but no, he was a big man, but a gentle soul. You know. So, and it's funny. Mother and father were totally opposites. She was Irish Catholic, and could be abrasive, and he was a real. He wasn't a pushover, but he had a real tender side to him for a big man, and Mum was an Irish Catholic. He was an atheist, but they both believed that the 10 Commandments that the Christian faith is based around were a good basis to raise a family. And my wife and I had the same attitude with our kids. So we were taught right from wrong and work ethics, and that's probably the greatest gift they gave us was work ethics and the right from wrong. And he used to say, "There's when it comes to right and wrong, it's only black and white. There's no grey." You know. So great people.
He was an atheist. How did that affect you?
And it's funny, you know. His mother was. My father was of Indigenous descent. His mother was an Indigenous woman, and she became a strict Presbyterian. She used to hook up the sulky of a Sunday morning and go down to Gladfield to the church. Now, it didn't really affect me because he always had the attitude that he didn't have to go to church to be a good person, and he would help people, and if he had any spare, he always helped people. And I went to a couple of Catholic schools. I spent 5 years in a boarding school. I went to 8 different schools because wherever he had worked, that's where we lived. And then I spent the last 5 years at a Catholic boarding school. And I always seemed to be able to reconcile that in my mind because he was a good man, good citizen, and I became very much like him, even though we were talking about it yesterday about, you know, is there a God and is there a heaven? And I suppose I've questioned it as many times as anyone else has. But as I said to Glenn yesterday, I hope there is a God and a heaven because I need someone to thank because I've had a really great life with more to come, I hope.
Tell us about boarding school. Did you enjoy that?
In hindsight, they were great years, you know, and I've still got mates 50 years later from there. And it was an agricultural college on the Herbert River up at Abergarie. So it was a different boarding school life. I got to play a lot of sport because that was your way of getting out of the college and going to Charters Towers to play footy or Townsville or whatever. And I wasn't really that interested in school as such. Before boarding school, I used to tell everyone I only went there to eat my lunch. Mum and pack lunch, so I had to go somewhere to eat it. But by the time I got to about grade 9 or 10 at boarding school, a new Christian brother arrived, a fellow called Brother McHenry. And he was in his late 70s then. And he was a marvellous teacher. He had a way of getting you interested in a subject. He did English, he did ancient and modern history, and by the time I'd done grade 10, I'd won a Commonwealth scholarship that paid to do a grade 11 and 12. So he sort of turned the corner for me as far as putting a bit more effort into the education. So I got through grade 12, and I would have liked to have done architecture. But of course, the family couldn't afford it. You know, it was different times in those days. So I think I finished the last exam on a Wednesday, caught the train home Thursday, went to work Monday.
The first job, tell us about that.
First job, driving a front end loader. on sewage reticulation work with father. Anyway, that went okay. I enjoyed working with him, but then I got itchy feet, and a friend said he had good work in the Territory, so I ended up in the Northern Territory.
It was a place of adventure back in the day, the Territory.
Well, it was, and it wasn't even a state then. It was still a federal territory under federal laws, and it was the last frontier. And it was full of men hiding from state laws for, what was it called when they had alimony? They call it alimony in America, don't they? But it was the last frontier. But there was a lot of good people there, and a lot of hard people, but people that were prepared to share their experience and knowledge. Great place to learn. Great place to learn.
So when the move from earthworks to truck driving, or was it all just integrated?
It's pretty much integrated, and after we were married, I was working for a company shifting earth-moving equipment around. And my knowledge or ability to drive earth-moving equipment helped me with the job, because they'd just tell me such and such is at a certain location, go and pick it up. They didn't have to leave anyone there, because I just load myself, whether it was a dozer or a loader or whatever. And they tend to be integrated. When I think back, the variety of work that I've done, I really shake my head sometimes, because, apart from all the driving and the earth moving, Marie and I have had a couple of small businesses and gone all right. I've sat on the board of a Catholic boarding school. I've sat on the board of Recreational Aviation Australia. I've been a private pilot. And, I've been involved with the kids' sport, junior sport, for many years before they became adults. And it's been a great variety. I know enough about that, a lot of different things, just enough knowledge to get myself into trouble. So,
is it your ability to think and common sense?
Under father's jurisdiction, you were given the opportunity, were expected to think for yourself. Yes, he realised mistakes would be made, but mistakes were often very good lessons. And usually he'd just laugh off if you made a blunder. If you made it the second time, the eyebrows would raise. And common sense, geez, there's not a lot of that around nowadays, is there?
Yeah, do you find that because you were out bush that you got a lot more of the chance to expand your horizons and think for yourself because you were out in the bush?
Absolutely. And in some cases it was, if you're up the Tanami track, you had enough tucker for 3 or 4 days and you broke down, well, you had to get going, otherwise you'd be hungry on day 5 and 6, So, it was during that time that I learnt to cook my world famous signature dish of T-bone steak and eggs, maybe with some onions on a good day.
Did you ever get stuck and worried about going to these remote places? Did you ever get a little bit concerned that you wouldn't get back?
I guess sometimes you did. I can't remember an occasion where I felt hopeless, because the reality was people always knew where you were going anyway, even though there was no communication. But if you weren't back by day 5 or 6, they'd probably come looking for you anyway. But but it was a challenge. You challenged yourself to keep yourself going or get yourself going again. And nowadays, us old fellas often laugh that if they break down on the road, the first thing they do is pick the phone up. We had no phones, we had no radio, so you had to. I remember my father told me a story once how he did a water pump on an old Chev truck on Cunningham's Gap, and he pulled the pump off, and the bearing had failed, needle bearings, and he pulled a board off one of the boxes. He had a load of fruit on, and he sat there with a pocket knife and whittled needles out of pine and put back in the bearing, packed it in grease, and it got him down to the markets in Brisbane, and got him, and then he could go and get another bearing and fix it properly, you know. So you had to use that sort of thinking, you know, if I can just get this fixed, this, you know, I remember once I was in a big body truck and I had a really long tail shaft, and the saddle holding the centre bearing broke. So the tail shaft fell down. So I got pulled up in time, and I cut leather straps off a machine that was on the back of the truck and used that to hold the tail shaft up. And about every 30 or 40 mile, the strap would wear through. So I'd cut another piece and put it up. And eventually, where was I? Yeah, I was between Chillagoe and Mareeba. So I got into Mareeba, and I was able to take the broken saddle to a welder and get him to weld it up and go and get a couple of bolts and bolt it back together and then head for home. And those, when you hop back in the truck and know you're fixed, you're right, you're on your way, you're pretty satisfying, you know, to think that, well, I got through that one, what's next?
Big miles heading out west, what do you think about?
I love music, and you know, as you know, the old radios weren't that good, and it was a blessing when the old tapes come in. I said to someone a while back about keeping one of the old hex pencils in the ashtray, and they said, was that to fill the logbook out? I said, no, that was to rewind the tapes.
Yeah.
Yeah, your mind would wander, and some days you'd get desperate and you'd pick up the ABC radio and listen to Question Time in the House of Representatives, which that showed you just how boring it was. But yeah, it's I often thought about plans of the future and working for myself, and yeah, like most people, you know, you think about the future, and even though I'm very keen, I was very keen on the history of the family. I didn't dwell on the past, but I certainly wanted to know about the past because of my admiration for that generation. So, and to this day, I still love music, all types, but generally, you know, country rock type stuff. And in Mackay, we've moved for the first time in our lives. We've moved into suburbia, and
how are you coping with that?
I think you should ask the neighbours how they're coping, actually. But I've got a two-bay shed in the workshop. I'm always making stuff, fire pits out of gas bottles, and, you know, I can still weld and that sort of stuff. And I've gone from a big zero turn mower to a battery-operated mower, a rechargeable battery-operated mower. But yeah, I think I'm coping quite well. I'm halfway through another book, and I only write when I'm really in the mood. But that fills the gaps, and I find it. I've got everything I need, and we travel a fair bit nowadays too. We did have a fifth wheel caravan, but we sold that, and we just stay in park cabins or whatever. And there's still a lot of places I've been that Marie hasn't been that I want to take her to. I think she shakes her head at me sometimes. We'll be driving along, and I say, if we just go around this bend, there's a bridge. There used to be a good little pub there on the right-hand side, you know. And yeah, I keep myself occupied.
Do you have a favourite place that you used to travel to?
I think one of the most brilliant places I've seen, I was coming back from Port Hedland, and I got into Halls Creek about 11 o'clock at night and tried to get some sleep, but the locals were fighting in the main street. So,
because that Fitzroy Halls Creek Road back in those days would have been a shocker.
Yeah. So I kept going, and I got just past the Argyle mine, and I needed sleep, so I pulled up, and there'd been a cyclone through there, and that's where you start to go through the escarpments up to Kununurra. And I woke up next morning just on daylight and boiled the billy, cup of black tea, and looked down. I used to call it the Valley of the Kings. You look down that road and the escarpments, and the water from the previous cyclone would be running down the escarpments, and the sun rises straight up that valley. And it was as if someone was turning a light on all the way, a spotlight on all the way down the valley, lighting up the water running off the escarpments. The most brilliant thing I've seen. And I looked around and I had no one to talk to about it. And no camera, of course, long before iPhones and that sort of thing. But of the places I like to drive to, I love going back to the Darling Downs because that was home. That was the spiritual home of the family. And I just loved the scenery and not that I didn't like the country out west. Its brutal harshness sometimes has a beauty that a lot of people don't see, but I loved it, absolutely loved it.
When you retired, you started writing. What was the inclination to put pen to paper?
Well, as I said, I wanted to record or find out more about the family. An annoying brother who kept at me to do it, and I thought it may help with the concentration. I'm still a very slow writer and a slow reader, but and if I do write, I'll do an hour of intense, what I call intense work, and then I'll walk away and I might do some the next day. Or, as I said, I'm halfway through another novel now that has nothing to do with the family, but something that's just come out of my imagination. So, but yeah, the main motivation really was with the book. I wanted the next generation, or my children especially, to know something about the family and where they came from.
So let's go back to the start of the book. 6 Hills Lane to...
6 Hills Lane to Gladefield, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so tell us about where it all started.
Well, I thought, okay, let's have a crack at this. So I started doing some research. I learnt to Google. The kids taught me to Google. I'm dangerous now, I can tell you. I rang my brother up, the annoying one in Sydney, and I said, look, I've made a decision on this. And he said, what? I said, I started this with expectations of recording every Mundey that's ever existed in the universe. And I said, I'll never live long enough. I said, so I'm going to refine this to one lineal chain through our great-grandparents. And then it became easy. It became clear to me I had parameters to work in, the timelines to work in, and so I started. And I said to myself, well, where do I start? The start's usually a good place, isn't it? So I went back to the start of the name and traced its origins back to Normandy. Then I went to our great-grandparents and concentrated on their immigration to Australia and why they immigrated.
So why did they come here?
It was the agricultural revolution in England or Great Britain. Machinery was taking over a lot of the manual labour work that had been done. My great-grandfather was a farm bailiff, which meant he was a farm foreman who looked after estates. So he had farming knowledge, and the Queensland government were opening up Queensland for agriculture. They wanted to open up more of the country. And they actually had an immigration officer in London recruiting people with farming experience to come over. And I think in those days they got passage and they might have got £40 or £50 and a guarantee of a job when they got here. And £40, £50 was a lot of money then too. So they arrived with, they originally had 12 children. 2 were deceased in England as young infants. They arrived with 9 children. It took me 6 months to find the other one. it turned out she was the oldest one. And she was 21 when they immigrated and was already married, so she stayed in England. And when you think about it, never saw her family again. Pretty tough times, weren't they, So once I established all of that and put it together, then I was able to work my way through that line through to my generation, and it came, even though it took 2 years. Once I'd established that in my mind and established the parameters, it became relatively easy. And because there's a lot of information out there, and most of it's freely accessible in government departments and that sort of thing. And for example, with the great-grandparents in England, I was able to build a story around their life just from the census. Every 10 years you knew how many kids they had, where they lived, what they did for employment. So you could build a story through that. And it was a great experience for me. The research, I really enjoyed it. And I spoke earlier on about trying to find the 10th member of the 10th child that never came out. And I found her at 3 o'clock one morning. And I found it through a funeral notice in the Warwick paper. Great-grandmother's funeral notice said survived by such and such and such and such, and her eldest daughter, Mrs. Richardson, in Manchester. And that was her. And she only died in the war years, 1946, I think. So it was very rewarding. It was great. It was something I'd never done before, so it was another new frontier.
Okay, so describe to me the writing process when you are writing. Do you type? Is it longhand? How do you do it? How does it all come together?
Well, many years ago, I worked my way up into management with one of the national transport companies, and that was the days when teletext was, the technology. Facsimiles had just come in, and I used to have to do a lot of writing, a lot of memos and that sort of thing. And my running writing, as the kids call it, was looked like an oil leak from a truck. So I learnt to print, so the girls could type it. And I eventually I was able to print faster than I could freehand. And nowadays I still print, and I married the typist.
That's keeping it in the family. So, you what year are we talking about when they came out? And did you find out anything about the experiences that they had?
Yeah, they came out. They actually came out on the good ship Limber in the 1890s, and they took up employment. Or the great-grandfather took up employment on a farm at Warwick, basically an estate, and he worked there for many, many years until they got enough money to buy 67 acres at Gladfield, and that was the first piece of property that any Mundey ever owned in the country. So probably ever owned in England too, because property owners in England were usually pretty wealthy people. So they took that up, and they would have had to do other work because they couldn't make a living for the whole family on 67 acres. But of course, by that time, some of the kids were off working anyway. They were adults themselves. And then my grandfather, who was only 4 when he arrived, in later years, he share farmed about 263 acres that was bordered that 67 acres, and he eventually bought it. And I think from memory, the farmer he bought it off financed it himself, and he had to pay out of his profits from his crops and that sort of thing. But yeah, they were basically farming people and dairy. They set up a dairy on that 263 acres, but it was always a pretty fine line because there was no irrigation. So you're in the lap of the gods, as people on the land only know too well.
Always looking skyward.
Exactly, yeah. Where did that one go?
It splits and go past. So the family, as it developed towards World War One, what happened with that?
Well, in World War One, my grandfather had married Mary Smales, who was an Indigenous woman. She had 3 brothers. Walter was the youngest. In World War One, Indigenous weren't supposed to enlist, but he, on his war record, complexion was put down as dark. So he went to Gallipoli. He went to North Africa first and then Gallipoli. And his next eldest brother, William, and I haven't been able to track all of this information down, but William had immigrated to New Zealand and married a New Zealand woman. And so he was conscripted into the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces. So we ended up with 2 great uncles who fought against a common enemy for different countries. Now, Walter died at Gallipoli. He was what was considered a bomb thrower. They used to make bombs out of, they used jam tins and anything full of explosives. And he died at Gallipoli. William went on to the Western Front and was wounded and went back to New Zealand, and he survived and he died at the age of 86 in New Zealand. So tough and interesting times.
Did you learn much about what they went through in Gallipoli?
No, not Walter himself, but yes, I did read as much as I could about, the trenches of Gallipoli and what fire they were under. And my annoying brother in Sydney has actually visited the gravesite in Gallipoli. So,
what was his reaction when he went there?
He told me he was very emotional. But he said he just felt as if someone had been there before him because there was flowers on Walter's grave. And maybe some member of the family had been there before, but maybe that's just something they do in the war graves anyway, the war cemeteries. So he found it very emotional, very emotional. That link, that connection. So and in the Second World War there was cousins that went off to war, and some of them, without naming them, struggled with it, came back, and one in particular died quite young, and he'd spent time in New Guinea in the swamps, and pretty hard stuff to get over and handle. So war's no fun. We're pretty fortunate we've had none near our shores for a long, long time. So I've got a son-in-law who's ex-digger. He spent 13 years in the army, toured Middle East, Malaysia, East Timor, 2 back-to-back tours for Afghanistan. He got out and did a couple of degrees and now works in management in the coal mines. So he's done really well for himself.
How did his war service treat him? Did he have any lasting problem? He
certainly had friends who have, but I think his trick was, and he was aware of this, he was a sergeant when he got out. He's a leader. When he got out, he was determined to keep himself busy. He sought employment that was, I guess, intense on purpose, and he's done a couple of degrees since, and he's workaholic. You've got to hold him back, He's but he's now a supply superintendent in the mines and doing really well. But I don't. He'll talk about it. Talks to me about it. Not a lot, but I don't think it ever leaves him. That sort of thing's got to put a scar on your heart and on your soul. But he seems to be handling it really well, and I think that is the trick. To have something meaningful to go on with. And I think that's where we let a lot of the vets down. And I've employed them over the years, in management. They get out of the army and they're good men and women and they're keen, but it's such a transition for them. They get a bit lost, some of them. And I know in the army, I've heard recruits say that you don't do anything unless you're told to do it. And when you get out into private enterprise, as an employer or a manager or a supervisor, you want your people to think for themselves and make decisions for themselves. And it's very hard for them to transition. But if they can do that, they're normally good workers, A lot of them are very experienced too.
Do you think that we do enough to repatriate our armed forces guys and girls when they get out of the forces?
Not at all. I'm not saying we just throw money do what the politicians do. They throw money at a problem and think they've fixed it. And I think that transition period for the vets and educating them to go to the new life, and it is a completely new life, is crucial for them to then continue on. When they're in the army, they're part of a family. The army or the Air Force or the Navy is their life. It's their whole life. They eat, sleep and breathe it. And if it's cut off just like that, it leaves a hell of a hole in a person's life, So I think we need to do more on that transition period to help them into employment. My brother in Sydney has got a couple of vets working for him now. And and I was really pleased to hear this, they had a 6-month period, I think, where they were able to go out and find some work and see if they liked it. And if they didn't, they could then re-enlist. I was talking to him the other day about him, and he said, they're out now and they're full-time with him, and they're going really, really well. And 6 months is not a long time, but at least it's something, But that transition period, I think, is crucial for them.
Plus, they must also miss the brotherhood.
Absolutely. I talked earlier about working in management for a national transport company, and I was involved with them as a subcontractor and later on as a manager for probably 15 years or something. And eventually they were taken over by the toll corporation. And I put my hand up for a redundancy because I'd already started my own business by this time. So, but when I left and went and did my own thing, I lost that network. And there was quite a few of those people I considered friends. There was quite a few of them that I didn't as well, but I lost that network. And you do feel it. You're always part of that conversation, that life. But for those guys and women, their network involves people that, they've fought and died with. So big transition, and that's where we really need to do more.
The first book that you wrote, basically your family history, what's the biggest thing you think you learned and took out of it?
On a serious note, I think the work ethic flows right through that story. Good, decent, hard-working people. And when we look back through the generations, my generation, so many of us with limited education have worked for ourselves. we've had a desire to do better. Three of my four brothers all work for ourselves, and so many in the family have even the generation before, my father and his 8 brothers and their 6 brothers and their sister, all at one time or another, all work for themselves, all employed people. So as a family, we've contributed to the society in our country. It's nice to know.
An immigration success story.
Absolutely.
You were talking about your grandfather and his wife Mary. They've really had an interesting time of it. What were the problems that they experienced being a white guy married to an Indigenous lady?
Well, I can only assume, and I'll tell a little story now. One of the brothers was married. One of their sons was married, and that marriage split up. But they had a little girl, and the mother took that little girl out to the farm to Grandma Mundey and said, "You'll have to look after her, I can't." So they had her there for 3 or 4 months, and after 3 or 4 months, that little girl's family from the other side got a policeman and a solicitor and came out and took that little girl away because in their eyes they couldn't see that shouldn't be raised by an Indigenous woman. And that little girl now is 84, and in hindsight she said she wished she'd stayed at the farm. You know?
What effect did it have on her? What happened?
She was taken and raised by the other side of the family, but because she was the outsider, I think she was dropped down the list, and all her clothes were hand-me-down clothes from her step-brothers and that sort of thing, and she just felt that she was at the bottom of the rung on the ladder, you know. And that was one great thing out of that book and that reunion. We found people we didn't know existed. So in her, we found another cousin. So there was positives at it. And yeah, she's still going. She's in her 80s, and I was only talking to her on the phone the other day.
How did you get the word out about the whole family reunion when you decided to put it all together?
That was 7 years ago. How did I do it? Letters. Yeah, postage stamps. So, and it took 12 months to put together because we made a weekend of it. We did tours of the cemetery on the Saturday, and then we did tours of the old farms, and I'd found the original 50 acres where Emily Smales, the great-grandmother, the Indigenous midwife, had lived, and I spoke to the people that owned that, so I was able to take bus tours there, and we did the farms, and we made a whole day of that. I had a minibus organised, a 22-seater, and we did about 3 or 4 tours. I was the tour director, of course. And then that night, anyone that wanted to sort of roll up at the RSL in Warwick. But then the following day, we had the official reunion at the Freestone Hall. And we had a luncheon there and ran through all the different lines of the family and who was there. And we still had Auntie Dot there. She was the wife of Dick Mundey. She was the last living relative of that generation. She's since passed. So it was a great day, and I got a lot of letters from different members of the family who really appreciated it because they'd never had a chance to catch up. As you know, people get busy in life and go their own direction. But yeah, so I'm trying to organise another one for next year because we've lost quite a few from the last one. So and we're all getting on. So I've sent out another lot of letters. But Glenn tells me he's going to help me organise a Facebook page. So if I can stay out of Facebook jail long enough, we might use a bit of technology this time. So see how it goes.
Do you think with the benefit of the internet now that you will find more people to come along?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. And I think Len's idea of the Facebook page could be a good one, yeah. So, yeah, but they're a hard thing to organise because, when you have a luncheon, you have to nail it down pretty close to the numbers because the caterers have to cater. And if they don't show up, I've got to pay the bill.
How many people did turn up?
I think about 135 at the last one, 140.
It's mega.
Hey?
It's mega.
Yeah. It was great. It was a great day.
You moved on to the second book, Quarter Caste Bastards. What was the presumption for writing that book?
Well, I tripped over that story in the first one, of course, during the research. And a couple of different people had told me about this incident. My father mentioned it briefly before, while he was alive, didn't say too much. But then I tripped over it again, and the eldest uncle's eldest child was still alive. And I sat and spoke with her on 2 occasions. The second time at Dubbo, and she was quite ill then, and she told me as much as she could, because she was a little girl when this all happened. So I thought, when I went through it, I thought it was a good story, but I didn't have all the facts. So I couldn't write it as a factual. So I wrote it as a fiction based around real life events and real characters.
So this was in the late 50s?
No,
or early 1952?
49.
49, okay.
Yeah, after the war, the brothers had all gone their own way because they were all in the Civil Construction Corps during the war, building roads and airfields and that sort of thing. And the eldest two, Alf or Bob, as they all had nicknames, because and Dick, who was Arthur, they end up down New South Wales, making their name for themselves in the coalfields, and they were subcontractors. They had some machinery and equipment of their own. In 1949, the Communist Party had gained control of the Coal Miners Union, and 23,000 coal miners went on strike. And what I'm saying now is fact has actually happened. So 23,000 coal miners went on strike, and it was a political strike. It wasn't under the pretense of getting better conditions for the coal miners. It was a Labor government, and the first time in Australian history that the army was called in peacetime to break a strike. The strike went for 7 weeks. But 7 men refused to strike. And that was my father and his 6 brothers.
Why is that?
It's strange. Most of them were good Labor men. But Bob had debt, he had machinery, and the bank wouldn't back him. They said, if you don't work, you lose your house, you lose your gear. And also, they had the principle that it wasn't a genuine strike, it was a political strike. So they kept working, and the other brothers came to help. And for 7 weeks, pretty violent times. Bob's wife, Kathleen, they had to arm her with a pistol so she could go and get groceries. And after the 7 weeks, the company abandoned them. The government settled with the unions and the company settled with the unions, but one of the stipulations was the union said we won't work with them. So the company, even though they encouraged them to keep working and applauded them when they worked, at the end of the 7 weeks, cut them free. So I set about writing a story. And 146,300 words later, we're finished.
But did they feel really cheated by that?
Absolutely. From what I can gather, yeah, they were. And they did get some retribution. It's in the story. But then, as was that generation, They all dispersed and got on with lives, and they settled all over from Townsville to Walgett, all over the East Coast basically, and continued on with life. And they were an amazing generation. I was only saying to someone the other day, my mother and father lost a house in big floods in Maitland. I think they rented that house. It wasn't theirs, but they lost everything. Many years later, they had a house burned down in Maryborough in Victoria. And then many years after that, they lost their house in Townsville, the Cyclone Althea. And like I was only a kid, just rebuild and keep going.
What do you remember about it? Was it fun?
What
the whole experience? Did you find it an adventure as a kid?
What, living with?
No, they're losing everything and having to get on and rebuild. And
well, the Maitland one, I wasn't born then, but the one in Maryborough, in Victoria, the drive-in picture theatre had opened in Bendigo, first one ever. So Dad took us over there for the pictures, and it was about 60 mile or something away. And we just got there and they called his name over the loudspeaker and he went up the office. They said, "You got to go back, the house is on fire." And by the time we got back there, it was burnt. And I don't really remember that much more about that, but I do remember Althea because I was an adult. And it was the first time we'd all been away together on holidays. And the house blew down. And we went straight back when we could get through because the roads were cut. We salvaged most of the furniture, even though it was spread around the paddock. Tough furniture in those days, it wasn't made of chipboard. And dried things out and picked up all the clothes and they salvaged all that. And then Dad bought an old house from North Ward in Townsville and shifted it to Woolgaroo and turned it into a home. Just that attitude of, well, we can't sit here and cry, we've got to keep going. They just seem to have that attitude.
Going back to the coal miners' strike, I just want to come back to that because there was quite a bit that went on at that time. Can you just run through in the story what you've talked about?
Yeah, well, of course, there was a lot of anger towards them, and they were all escorted in to the mine daily. They would alternate their shifts from day shift to night shift. They even had other entries into the mine. This is in Cullen to get away from the pickets and the rock throwing and all the rest of it. As I said, Kathleen had to be armed with a pistol. A lot of animosity in the town towards them all.
Why were they the only group and crew that would actually work? Why weren't there others that actually joined them?
Well, they were subcontractors. They owned machinery, or them and the banks owned the machinery. So they had a pretty fair debt. That's why they had to keep working. The others were all employees. They were just employees. So, and of course, fear. There's fear in a mob, it creates a lot of fear. So, yeah, they were tough times. And after the 7 weeks, they had to move on, but they sought retribution. And I don't want to tell you too much about that because people won't read the book if I tell the whole story. But
well, I'm sure it's a great yarn. So that sort of retribution, what sort of were some of the things that happened?
Well, from what I can understand, the company did help in some way in that they bought the equipment that they had. They basically paid the loan out. There was no money left over, and they were able to sell a couple of houses because there was accommodation was in short supply. So they were able to sell those and they made some money. But for years and years it was alleged machinery was being stolen and equipment being stolen by certain members of the workforce. They tripped over the stash. The brothers tripped over the stash where a lot of the stuff was hidden. So they set a plan up where they would, at a certain time, they would leave and take as much as they could with them. The tractor ended up on a family farm, and a couple of trucks ended up working for the main roads around the Darling Downs, and that's what they did, yeah.
What was your reaction when you were researching it, when you're finding these things out? Did you know about it before you started?
Not all of it, no. And I filled gaps, of course. As I said, it's a fiction based, around real life events and people. I was just astounded at their boldness and their bravery. To take a stand, draw a line in the sand, take a stand. Quite amazing. And I think it runs in the family. I had to break the picket line at Queensland Nickel many years later in my own truck.
What happened there?
I was subcontracting to one of the TNT groups, and the union had gone on strike there, and I knew them all. They said, "You've got to take this load out there." And I said, "Well, they're on strike." And I said, "If you don't take it out, you haven't got a job." And I had a truck that I had to pay for. I had a new mortgage. So I went out there and it got a little heated for a little while, but I knew the union delegates, and I said to them, "Look, I'm up against the wall here. I don't go in, I lose everything I got. But I'll tell you what I will do. I go in, I'll unload, and I'll find out what's going on, and I'll let you know on the way out." So they agreed to that, and we got over it. And then many, many years later, my son, who's an accountant for an American company, he was getting married, and he was a junior accountant at this stage. So he took 12 months off and went and worked with his father-in-law at Curtis Island as an industrial painter to get some money to get married. And they went on strike there, and he broke the picket line with a half a dozen others as well because he wanted to keep working. So, runs in the family.
Is it the work ethic?
I think so. We, during my working life, I've made mistakes, and it's an embarrassment, but you want to get the job done. And I've always said to my children, if you show up when you're supposed to show up and do what you've been asked to do, you'll be ahead of 70% of the population. They've proved that. They're both successful people. So, I think, as I said earlier on, that's one of the biggest gifts our parents gave us was work ethic. It's just, you look at the ads in the paper now. See, if you haven't got a job today, you don't want one. So, interesting times.
Do you think you passed your work ethic on to your kids?
I think both mine and my wife's work ethic has been passed on. My wife's always been a worker, and I think they got a big percentage of their moral compass from my wife. Because I was away a fair bit at the time.
And that's what I was going to ask you about, because you are spending so much time on the road. How tough is it to have a family life when you are a long-distance truck driver?
It is. And as the kids grew, I sought more work that would let me work long hours during the week and at least get one day off on a weekend, because I got involved in their sports, and I just big fan of sports for kids. It's just one of the foundations that help turn them into decent people and people who can communicate and And so I deliberately sought work that would let me or allow me to do that. And I mean, I remember in the fuel days, my Monday to Friday was out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, leave the depot at 2. You do 14 hours plus your 2 half-hour breaks. That's 15 hours. So you'd get home at 6 at night, 6, 7 at night, have a shower, feed, a couple of light beers, get into bed, out of bed at 1. Do that Monday to Friday, and you do, 70 hours in 5 days, and then try and recover by Monday morning again. And interesting. I lived on acreage, and I'm a bit of a particular sort of a bloke, and one of my brothers said to me, I don't know how you kept that block so tidy and worked the hours you did. And it's called youth.
Yeah.
I haven't got it anymore.
With the price of fuel going up these days, $2.30, $2.40 a litre, and looking like being on the rise when the excise is re-added onto the cost, how hard do you think it is for people in the transport industry and earth moving going forward?
They're falling like flies. If they can't get their prices up, they'll disappear from the market. And I mean, there's small regional transport companies closing every week. People who started businesses, had them going for 20, 30 years, and they're my vintage, they're looking to retire. They can't sell the business. No one wants a transport business anymore. There's no margins left in it. So they just have an auction and walk away. And all the forces are against them getting their prices up. And it's something I said to Bob Catter many, many years ago. If transport operators got paid the right money, the price of everything in this country would go up, inflation would go up, and the only way you control it is with interest rates.
It's got to happen.
Oh, it's got to, but I think it's, they're talking a possible recession. I have no doubt we will have a recession. And I'm no economist, but I've owned businesses and I know how to read a P&L sheet, and I think it could be a lot longer than they're saying. I lived through the recession we had to have with Keating, and we were paying 18% interest on our mortgage. And people say, how'd you pay it? I said, we owed $25,000 or $30,000, not $800,000 or $600,000 that a lot of the kids owe nowadays. It's just mind-boggling. And I bought my first truck, I think it was $5,000. And I paid another $2,000 for a trailer, second hand. A new Kenworth and a trailer now. No change out of $500,000. $25,000 a year to register it. Another $25,000 for insurance. Just can't keep going. So I think we're in. If they do get their prices up and get paid the right money,
well, they have to, or too many will go bust.
Yeah. And the other thing this country needs is 2 more supermarket chains, because they just control way too much of not only the commodity, the food market, the transport market as well. And that's why I was always critical of Rudd with his $900. Everyone went and bought Chinese televisions. That money could have started the construction of a parallel railway line from Melbourne to Cairns, designated just for freight, and taken half the trucks off the road.
They should have put it into infrastructure. I thought that was wasted money.
Yeah. Absolutely. If we had a parallel line, say to Cairns, designated for freight, half the trucks off the road, reduces the maintenance on the highway. I've just driven down the Bruce Highway, and even the sections just opened, the new sections have fallen apart. And it would have created work for a decade as well in the construction. So,
But they also gave the money to the people that weren't producing.
exactly. And I remember reading an article, because I take interest in news around Warwick, because that was the home. And during that period, the pokies in Warwick recorded a record take. I think there was one week 700,000 or something went into pokies. So a lot of people who really should have spent that money more wisely put it into the pokies, or just as you say, infrastructure.
So the government got the money back anyway.
They did, absolutely.
So as you look further ahead then for your kids, what do you see economically? Do you think that we could end up with another depression?
When you look at the likes of Sri Lanka and Ukraine-Russia war, there's every reason to think it is possible. I mean, my own children, they're quite successful and going along fine.
Well, your grandkids,
Yeah. I mean, in reality, if I could wave my magic wand and become a benevolent dictator overnight, I would change the whole institution of our country, the whole federation. We're only 25 million people. The first thing I do is get rid of the state governments. We're just most over-governed country in the world. You imagine a country with common civil and criminal laws, common road rules, it's just common environmental rules. We're just burdened with red tape and green tape. I'd change the whole tax system.
What would you do? You've been in business. What would you do to change the tax system?
All wage and salary earners would pay a flat rate of 15%, regardless of how much you earn. I see no sense in punishing hard work or rewarding lazy work. 15%. Everyone pays 15%. The GST would go to 15% with no... Oh, let me go back. The 15% wage for the wage and salary earners, no tax returns, no deductions. That 15% just goes to the government every week. Gives the wage and salary earner more money to spend. GST to go to 15% with no exemptions. And into the Constitution I would put that 1% of that GST, or 1.5% of it, would go into a fund for aged care. Another 1.5% would go into a pension fund. And I reckon within a decade, you wouldn't need superannuation funds because there'd be enough there for a pension for every man and woman in the country. And when it comes to companies, ABN holders, proprietary limiters, trusts, they don't do tax returns. They just pay 3% of their turnover. And that way you pick up everyone. For example, a mining company that produces 1 million tonne a year, worth $20 a tonne, they sell it to their holding company in Singapore for cost, because Singapore only, or a small margin, because Singapore only pay 10%. Doesn't matter. They sell 1 million tonne at $20 a tonne. They pay 3% of that. And what it does for the business people and the tradies and everyone, they know exactly what their tax component is each year. It's 3%. But if you earn it in this country, you pay 3% of your turnover. You pick up the Microsofts, you pick up the Googles, you pick up the mining companies, and I think that's a much fairer situation. I think without the benefit of modelling, I think the government would have a bigger tax base. And the other thing, and the bureaucrats would fight against this, there is another system very similar in the world, and they administer their tax system with 2,000 people, and they've got roughly the same population. We've got over 15,000 bureaucrats in our ATO, so the bureaucrats may not like it. So, interesting. But I don't think I'm going to get the job.
You say you were having some discussions and interaction with Bob Catter.
Long time ago, yeah, when I was in management, yeah.
What do you think of him?
I think he's a good man, and I've met him a couple of times in different situations.
But essentially, he's a professional politician.
He is, and I was in many ways a supporter of his for a long time, but I'm not sure what Bob stands for anymore. In the last election, he was pushing for the Hell's Gate Dam, and then when Morrison said, "Well, here's the money," Bob jumped up and down, and I felt that why doesn't he want it now? Because that was his crown that he was running on, but it had been taken away from him because Morrison made the money available. So, I'm not sure what Bob stands for anyway.
We've recently had a change of government with the federal election.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think will be the effect of a Labor government in these trying times?
Well, just based on experience, and you're talking to someone who's worked on both sides of the spectrum. I've been a union delegate as a younger man, and I've also been a small business owner. And based on history, Labor tend to struggle to be fiscally responsible.
Well, they spend it, and the Liberal government generally repairs it. So, going into a period as you believe of an economic recession, or even possibly worse, did the voters do the right thing?
Well, I'm sure they think they did. But once again, going back to me being a benevolent dictator and wanting to change the system, when a party can gain a majority in the House of Representatives with 31% of the primary vote, I think our system needs to be looked at. It's I didn't see that, and I didn't vote for Labor or Liberal this time around, but I don't see that result as reflective of the wish of the people, to be honest with you. But others would argue that that's the way it is, and that's the way it is. The reality is, in the last federal election, Labor won 80% of their seats only with the help of the Green preferences. And I saw some figures the other day, and I've been against preference voting for a long time. And if there's going to be preferences, it should only be the voter who is allowed to preference, and not parties. But I saw some figures the other day about first across the line. And if first across the line had been in this election, they were saying that Labor probably still would have won anyway. So, it's I don't know what the result is. But to go back to your question, if Labor continue their traditional way of governance, it will only fuel inflationary pressures. And unfortunately, the only mechanism we now seem to have are interest rates, to rise interest rates to try and stop people spending. But we now have a generation of young people who have no fear of debt. And it was quite interesting with the recent first rate increase. My son made the statement that if everyone gave up their latte on the way to work of a morning, it would probably more than cover the cost of their mortgage increase. So we've really developed a lifestyle now that lends itself to free spending, and I don't know whether the current generation's got the self-discipline to pull themselves back from that lifestyle, and a lifestyle of what's the word, commodities. That we were only talking the other day when we built our first house. I was able to do a lot of it as an owner-builder. That's disappeared now. People aren't able to do that. And on the way home from work, I would go down into the river and load of topsoil onto the ute and spread that out around the yard late of an afternoon. Plant our own lawn and do all that. We sat on boxes for chairs for a while, slept on a mattress on the floor until we could afford furniture. And nowadays, when they move into a new home, it's got the irrigation done, the lawn done, the furniture's in there, the four-wheel drive's in the driveway. And I don't begrudge the modern generation that stuff, but you've got to pay for it. You know, it's with all you can have all the creative accounting in the world, but at the end of the day, you've got to pay your debts. And I don't know whether this generation is, like I said, self-disciplined enough to pull back from that and accept a little less.
Do you think there'll be carnage economically because of the way that they have that McDonald's quick fix and want it now, pay later mentality?
Oh, I think in some sections of the economy there will be, and gee, when you look at some of the house prices in the last 12 months, I wouldn't like that hanging over my head. But of course, my generation inherited basically a fear of debt or an absolute must to control your debt, you know.
Was that because it was still the hangover of the depression? Because the stock market didn't, when the drop wasn't, it didn't sort of like come back to the levels of pre-depression until the 50s.
Yeah, it's absolutely a hangover from those, you know. I inherited that hangover from my parents' generation, the control of debt. But of course, I'm reaping the benefit of it now. We're self-funded retirees. We're not wealthy, but we're self-funded retirees, and we're enjoying the fruit of all that hard work and controlling debt earlier on. As my son said the other day, go and enjoy yourself, Dad. Just don't leave me a debt. So,
well, they're more than happy, the younger generation, to accept the money from an inheritance, but they don't want the debt.
Absolutely. And I get the impression there's a lot of the younger generation factoring that inheritance into their calculations for the future, whereas in my generation, we didn't expect to get left too much at all, because the previous generation, it was all about survival, you know. And when my father died, he left Mum in a house that she owned and a modest bank account. She got a government pension, and realistically, she could live reasonably well on that. But nowadays, boy, the McMansions need more than the pension to keep them going.
When you're talking about the pensions, what do you think about the welfare system if we do have economic hard times?
Really, when you look at anyone out there that's paid a tax bill, the government sends you a sheet and it shows you in percentages where your money goes. And welfare's not that high on a percentage basis. And I forget the figures. But I was interested the other day to hear Labor's new policy on unemployment and the points system. They're changing it to a points system. To get your dole, you have to get so many points each month. And pardon me, that's, from my point of view, that seems to be a much tougher position than the coalition had on it, and it's probably a good move. I don't think there's that many out there that really are bludging on the dole, to coin an Australian phrase. I think there's a lot of people out there that do need help, but it's going to be tough for governments, regardless of their colour. If there is a prolonged recession, it's going to be tough for them to make sure the really necessary welfare to go to the people that must have it. And there are, with health and aged care and NDIS and all that sort of stuff, there's people out there that do need our help. And as recession bites, and if it's prolonged, it's going to be difficult for governments to make a decision. And the first area they can cut, which has got plenty of fat in it, is the size of government. Our government's costs are enormous in this country. Once again, I'd get rid of all the state governments.
But they aren't going to cut their own throat.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely not. No. That's, that'd be like telling the football coach he's got to drop his son from the next game.
You've got another book coming out and you're working on it at the moment. Tell us about that one.
It's futuristic, 2031. It's about a retired Mossad agent in his 60s and his wife. She's a medical researcher, escaping the brutality and corruption of a socialist state of Victoria in 2031. Bit murderous, pretty dark, something completely different. I'm about halfway through it, and I have to be honest, I've stalled. I've got sort of involved in other bits and pieces, and the typist is dragging the chain too, I must admit. but I'll get back to it. And like I said earlier on, I really only write when I'm in the mood. I don't do anything in life anymore that doesn't feel enjoyable. So, I'll get back to it.
How many books do you think you have in you?
Have you heard anything? You haven't been talking to God about a timeline? I'd like to do a story out of the first book about the two brothers who fought in the First World War, the two Indigenous boys. I think there's a story there. I'd like to get a couple more done. But once again, while it's enjoyable and if people find some enjoyment out of it, I've had a great response from this second book from not only family but friends and associates of family members. I got a call the other day. A friend of mine wants a book to send it to Canada to a friend of his who's got bookstores over there. So, and he just finished reading it a second time. So, a couple of more books would be nice. But once again, at my pace, at my time. And I'm probably going to have to buy the odd steak dinner and Chardonnay for the typist to catch up.
You became a pilot as well. Is that something that you enjoyed? Was it just a hobby, or did you? Initially, as a young lad, I would have liked to join the Air Force, but that wasn't to be. But I eventually became a recreational pilot. It was a hobby, but I absolutely loved it because. And I think one of the reasons was the self-discipline required. You do it right or you die, basically. And if you do it right, it really is enjoyable. Well, you run out of fuel and you can't park somewhere.
I had one engine out, but that was fine. It was over the Flinders Highway, the longest airstrip in the world. So
Forced landing?
Yeah. Luckily, it was close to Prairie, and there's a pub there.
So what happened?
Oh, just a magneto problem. It was fixable, but it's hard to fix in the air. But I miss it. But when you retire and the money stops coming in one end, you've got to make sure there's not too much going out the other end.
It's a very expensive hobby.
Oh, yeah, it is. And it runs in the family. I've got cousins that have flown. My brother in Sydney is a pilot. He actually, a couple of years ago, sold his flight training school at the Gold Coast. He had a flight training school there as one of his businesses. And in 2006, he and I went to the Oshkosh Air Show, a lifelong dream.
That's a biggie.
Yeah, spent 4 hours in a B-17 Flying Fortress.
Wow.
Had to pay for the privilege, but would never get another chance. And actually, we hopped on a plane in LA and to go up to Appleton, Wisconsin, and sat down beside Carroll Shelby, the race car driver. So we had a flight with him and several drinks, and he was going up to release the GT500 Mustang because Ford were responsive for the Oshkosh Air Show. And so he said, come to the Ford tent tomorrow and let the security know. So we went there and had lunch with him. He was a great fella, down to earth. He'd had, I think, 6 wives and 2 hearts, so he'd lived life to his fullest. And I think he only passed last year. And he picked our accent straight away because his best mate was Jack Brabham, and he used to come over to Sydney every 2 years to see him. So, yeah, interesting. But I think my greatest achievement with flying, we had friends who separated, and they had a 14-year-old son who took it really bad. For a young kid, it's a bad time to go through at 14. I used to take him flying. He's now a second officer on 757s out of Cathay Pacific at Hong Kong. So nice to know I've had some influence on someone.
Did you ever think of taking it further yourself?
By the time I'd gotten into it, I was too old, basically. You really need to be in there at a young age, But I'm still a YouTube buff with all the flying stories, and it's just the creativity of the people that build this stuff and make it work is just amazing. It's amazing, especially for a bloke who was amazed when he saw his first facsimile machine. But yeah, loved it, absolutely loved it. Recommend it to any young people out there. Amazing.
So, looking back now over your life, what would you say are some of the highlights? Do you look back and as you now are retired and reminisce about your life, what are some of the things that you just go, wow, I'm so glad I've done that?
Well, I married the right girl. No, I couldn't have had a better partner.
Yeah.
Kids couldn't have had a better mother, and now the grandkids have got the best nanny. But that's been the cornerstone of my life, the family.
Was that fate, though, when you said that she was in the office?
Yeah, I think so. It's so I decided, bugger Alaska, I'm not. But it's funny, like after about 3 months, a mate of mine said to me, how you going with the girl out the front? Because he knew I was keen on her. And I said, not real good. She didn't really want much to do with me. He said, maybe if you had a shave and cut your hair and got rid of those Northern Territory swamp clothes, you might have half a chance. So I did that, cleaned myself up a bit, and after she started talking to me, and after about 6 months, she started taking half my pay and putting it in the safe. Those days we got paid in a brown envelope, in cash, and all the details are written on the front. And that was so I had some money on Monday, because, Friday afternoon down the pub and all the rest of it. Spending your money on cars. And so after about 6 months, she started taking half my pay and putting it in the safe. Then after about 9 months, she eventually went out with me. And that's when she started taking all the pay. But, I look at different things. I worked my way up into management. I ran one of the most profitable road divisions outside of Brisbane with limited education. Sat on the board of a boys' college, sat on the board of recreational aviation. These books, something I never thought I'd do. And I look back at them now and think, geez, did I do that? But Father always said, you'll walk past a lot of doors in life. Open them. You never know what's on the other side. So I thought that was a good philosophy. Don't be scared to have a go, and don't worry about what people say. As I said before, it's none of our business. Just go and have a go. Yeah, I've had a great life, with more to come, I hope.
Sounds like a good philosophy.
Yeah, that's the plan. That's the plan.
Terry Mundey, thanks for joining us over the bonnet.
Thank you.